Hi everyone, my name's Jenny and I'm back today with another video. I'm going to try to keep this pretty short and casual and fairly unedited as I hurt my shoulder over the weekend. I believe I was lugging some hefty soil around for gardening purposes and I think that might have done me in, as it is very painful now. So I don't want to be editing too much in front of the computer. But I saw that Karen from Run Right Reads, I will put a link to her video and her channel down in the description box below, as well as Lindsay from Lindsay's Bookish Life, do this video of discussing 27 Black women writers in honor of Brianna Taylor's 27th birthday, which was this past Friday. Unfortunately, Brianna Taylor did not live to see her 27th birthday, as she was killed by police in her home while asleep in Louisville, Kentucky, and the officers who murdered Brianna Taylor have not been arrested. There is an FBI investigation, as well as a Change.org position and several places where you can donate to help put Brianna Taylor's death to justice. So I will put all of that information in the description box below. But as a memoriam to her and her life, several people here on BookTube have been doing this video wherein they discuss 27 books by Black women writers to honor Brianna's birthday. So I wanted to do the same, so hopefully this video will not be terribly long, and let's just get into it. So the first one that I want to mention, I actually don't have my copy right now, and that is Beloved by Toni Morrison, or Toni Morrison in general, although I think Beloved is a great starting point for her. As Lindsay said in her video, she began with Beloved as well. This is the great American novel. It's probably the best American novel ever written, I would go as far to say, and this tells the story of an enslaved woman escaping slavery during the late 1800s with her two children, as she does not want them to experience slavery. It is an incredibly difficult read. It is so sad, but it is so important for that reason, and is something that we as Americans should continue to revisit, especially as white Americans. So I would highly recommend Toni Morrison. I've actually not read any other Toni Morrison, which I've been meaning to do since I read this back in high school, but I am hoping to remedy that very soon. I have Song of Solomon coming to me from my local independent feminist bookstore, and I'm hoping to read that as soon as possible. So the next one that I have is another classic, which is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This one was published in 1982, and Alice Walker is still alive. Toni Morrison unfortunately died last year. And this one tells the story of two sisters born in the early 1900s in the southeastern United States, and it tells the story of the two of them growing up. Both of them experience immense abuse both in their childhood, and then later one of the sisters experiences abuse during her marriage. Her husband is abusive to her, and this story just tells of these two sisters as they are separated from one another, and they write letters to one another as well as to God, and so it's a really amazing examination of sisterhood and faith and the kind of passions that bring people together. This was also made into a movie that is very, very well received. It has a young Oprah Winfrey in it. Would highly recommend the movie as well, and it's actually been adapted into a play and a musical as well, but the novel is fantastic and I would highly recommend it. Moving now into some more historical literary fiction, we first have Homegoing by Yad Jossi. This is Jossi's debut release, and Jossi is a Ghanaian woman who moved to the United States with her family when she was relatively young, still a small child. And this tells the story of, again, two sisters who are half-sisters born in 1775 in Ghana, one of whom ends up marrying a Dutch slave trader, and the other of whom is sold into slavery and sent to the United States. From there, we then follow the rest of their family lineage all the way to the present day. And Jossi explores some really important time periods in this. Obviously, since the novel begins in 1775, several generations of the sisters sold into slavery's family experience slavery, and then through that, after slavery was abolished in 1865 here in the US, they continue to experience sharecropping, as well as one of them, I believe, moves to the north during the Great Migration. So, and then the family in Ghana continues to live in Ghana and eventually moves to the United States as well, where they also experience rampant racism. So this one is just absolutely phenomenal. Would highly recommend this one if you've not read it. moving on, the next one I have is Essia Dugan's Washington Black. Dugan is a Canadian Black woman. I'm not entirely sure where in Canada she lives, but I do know she's Canadian. And this tells the story, this is a neo-slave narrative that tells the story of Washington Black, who is a slave in Barbados in the Caribbean. And it tells the story of him as the brother of his master, who is an abolitionist, takes an interest in Washington Black and his engineering abilities, as the abolitionist's brother wants to invent this this form of transportation. I guess I can't quite remember what they call it in the book, but this one has such fascinating themes of kind of white allyship, if that makes sense, in terms of the abolitionist brother, while being an abolitionist and believing that slavery should be abolished, does not see Washington as an equal in any way. He continues to believe that Black people are inherently inferior to him as a white person, and that discussion continues through the novel with several other characters as well. So Dugan tackles a very important idea of reminding all of us that abolitionists were not necessarily people that believed that equality was the next step after the abolition of slavery. In fact, many of them used the abolitionist movement as a way to continue the racial divide between white and Black people in America as well as the Caribbean. So highly recommend this one as well. Next, we have The Revisioners by Margret Wilkerson Sexton. Sexton is a Black woman living here in America. She currently lives in the Bay Area, although I believe she was born and raised in New Orleans, which is where this book takes place. So this one follows two timelines, the first of which is a present-day timeline in 2017 that follows a single mother named Ava, who moves in with her white grandmother. So her father is white, and she moves in with her white grandmother after falling on some hard times, and basically has to care for her grandmother as she begins to deteriorate mentally and physically with age. Additionally, this novel also follows Ava's great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother Josephine, who was born into slavery in the late 1850s, and then we follow her around the 1920s, as she is a much older woman who oversees a large farm that she and her husband were able to purchase from the people that they were sharecropping from in the New Orleans, Louisiana, southern Louisiana area. And this one just has such amazing parallels between the two stories of white people and white supremacy, and how those two things manifest in the 1920s with the Ku Klux Klan, and then in 2017 with divides in education, everything we're seeing today in terms of education, mass incarceration, racial profiling, all of those things. Sexton ties those two together so well to point out that there's really not much of a difference between the Ku Klux Klan in 1924 and the systems of oppression that we see today in 2017. So would highly, highly recommend Margret Wilkerson Sexton's work as well. Next, we have a Nigerian-born author who likely needs no introduction, and that's Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you're looking for one specifically about race in America, I would recommend Americana, although personally I preferred Half a Yellow Sun. This is one of my favorite books of all time. But Americana tells the story of a Black female immigrant from Nigeria who immigrates here to the United States and provides some really amazing dialogues in terms of a discussion of race that is much more nuanced than I think a lot of the very surface level discussions we have, in that Ngozi Adichie discusses the intersection of immigration and race, and how for white people, Black people often seem all the same, but for her as a Nigerian woman, our main narrator felt that her experiences as a woman who has recently immigrated to the United States are inherently different from those that have a history that can trace their ancestry through American slavery. So there's some really fascinating dialogues about the nuances of Black people in America, and the emphasis that all Black people in America have not had these same experiences, nor could we ever decide that they are all one cohesive group. So this one is really phenomenal for that reason. And then Half a Yellow Sun, I just found the storytelling in this to be so compelling, but this tells the story of the Nigerian Civil War in the 1960s. So there are some dialogues of colonialism and recent post-colonialism in this one, as the as Nigeria had just become independent around the time of the Civil War, which is part of what precipitated the Civil War in Nigeria, or this first Civil War. There have been since, I believe, 1 or 2 other civil wars. So there are some British characters in here which provide a really interesting dialogue on colonialism, as well as some Nigerian people from a few different tribes within Nigeria. So would highly recommend this one as well. Then we have another woman who traces her ancestry back to Nigeria, who is Bernardin Evaristo, although Bernardin Evaristo is an Anglo-Nigerian woman, as it says on the back. So I believe she and her family have lived in the UK for a generation or 2. So Girl, Woman, Other co-won the Booker Prize this past year, and I recently read this for the BookTube Prize, and I absolutely loved it. So in this novel, Bernardin Evaristo tracks the narratives of 12 Black British women living in the UK, although one of them actually doesn't live in the UK, and basically just tells the stories of their lives and the ways that their lives intersect, as well as the ways that race plays a role in their lives, in addition to gender discrimination and socioeconomic discrimination. So this one is just absolutely phenomenal. If you're looking for a book on like Black British voices, Girl, Woman, Other is just absolutely phenomenal and would highly recommend it. Next, we have one that I actually don't have the copy of, but I do have a second book by this author that I haven't read, which that second book is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I originally read The Mothers several years ago, which tells the story of a young teenage girl who has just lost her mother to suicide, who becomes pregnant during her high school years, and basically has to come to terms with what she wants to do with that pregnancy, whether she wants to give the child up for adoption and carry the child to term, whether she wants to keep the child, or whether she wants to get an abortion. And the novel follows her making that decision, as well as the repercussions after that. And it's set in Southern California in this Black community, and I really, really enjoyed that one. And then this one, The Vanishing Half, which I do want to say that I am aware of everything that has come to light according with Book of the Month this past couple of days, and I am thinking a lot about it and how to ensure that Book of the Month actually ensure that Book of the Month is actually committing to diversifying their reading lists, as well as amplifying the voices of people of color, particularly Black authors, given their national platform. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I am aware of all of that, and thinking about my own consumption of Book of the Month moving forward. So this one was a Book of the Month pick for June, and this tells the story of 2 sisters born in the 1960s, I believe, 1950s or 60s, who are both fairly light-skinned, and so one of them, as she grows older, ends up deciding to present herself as white passing. So she marries a white man, and he does not know that she is really Black, and it tells kind of their divulging stories, as well as, I think, their sisterhood. So I'm very, very intrigued about this one, want to get to it very soon, and would just recommend Britt Bennett again as another author to check out. Moving into some books that are a bit more of the like contemporary lighthearted side, because I think that is also equally important in talking about amplifying Black female voices. We first have another Book of the Month pick, which is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Dare. Dare is a Nigerian-born woman who currently lives in the UK, and this follows the story of Aduni, who is a young girl who is born into a rural village in Nigeria. She is not born into a family with very much money or power really within the small village that she lives in, and her dream is to gain an education and therefore have a voice that speaks and has power within her community and country at large. And unfortunately, as is the case with many girls born into poor families in rural villages, she is sold basically into a child marriage with an older man in the village who has a lot of power, and then later sold into child slavery as a housemaid to a wealthier woman living in Lagos. So this one has a lot of interesting dialogues in terms of wealth disparities, particularly within Nigeria, but I think they're applicable to other countries as well. As well as the like hopefulness that Aduni has in terms of gaining an education is just really, really inspiring. So I would highly recommend this one as well. Additionally, we have Queenie by Candice Cardi Williams. This one I read at the beginning of this year and really, really enjoyed. Queenie is a very flawed character, but her story in terms of getting the help she needs, as well as identifying the racism that she is living with within her own life, is so meaningful and important. And I just loved this story. I loved how lighthearted it was while also tackling such important issues. And additionally, I also just loved how flawed Queenie was and how over the course of the novel she realizes those flaws. So I would highly recommend this one in terms of a lighter read that tackles some really important issues. And Candice Carter-Williams is of Jamaican descent, although she lives in the UK currently. And that is also true of Queenie, who is also has ancestry that traces back to Jamaica, but is living in the UK. Next, this one is particularly timely given that it takes place in Louisville, Kentucky, and is written by an author who's from Louisville, Kentucky, and this is Whiskey and Ribbons by Lisa Cross Smith. This was published by Hub City Press, which is a small indie press that tries to amplify Southern voices. It's based out of Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I would highly recommend you check them out. And this one tells the story of Evangeline, who has just lost her husband, who was a police officer who was killed in the line of duty, as well as her developing relationship with his adopted brother Dalton. And we find out the parentage of Dalton and how Dalton and her husband Eamon are related to one another, as well as watch Evangeline and Dalton's relationship unfold. So this one I think is a really important read to read during this time, as it is, so timely to the story of Brianna Taylor, in that it takes place in Louisville, Kentucky, and has police officer characters. So I would highly recommend checking out Lisa Cross Smith's work. It is on the lighter side, but again, that is just as important as some of the more heavier topics. So would highly recommend this one as well. Then moving into kind of full-on romance, we first have Intercepted by Alexa Martin. Martin writes sports romances that are published by Berkeley that predominantly feature at least one black main character. This one features Marley, who is a black woman who is dating a white quarterback for the Denver Broncos at the start of the novel, and over the course of the novel, she develops a relationship with a new white quarterback to the team, whose name is Gavin. So this one has some interesting dialogue in terms of relationships between multiracial relationships, as well as some important dialogue regarding sports and race, which it definitely could have done a bit more of, but I think it could definitely help someone begin to think about those dialogues and potentially investigate that further. So Alexa Martin, if you're looking for a black romance author, which actually we'll have several to talk about, is definitely one to look out for. Speaking of another black romance author that I would highly recommend is Jasmine Guillory. She wrote The Wedding Date, The Proposal, which I no longer have, The Wedding Party, and Royal Holiday, all of which I have read and really enjoyed. And I would probably most recommend The Wedding Party, although The Wedding Date is also really phenomenal. These are my two favorites of the collection. But The Wedding Party is an enemies to lovers romance between two black characters living in Oakland, California, and it is just really phenomenal. This one, The Wedding Date, is I didn't know what trope you would call this, but these two people meet in an elevator, and both of them need a date to, one of them needs a date to a wedding that they really don't want to go to, and so the other one ends up being their date. And this one is an interracial relationship, so it has some really good dialogues in terms of Alexa, our main character, and her love interest, Drew, who is a white doctor. Kind of Alexa putting Drew in his place frequently throughout the novel in terms of acknowledging his privileges as a white man who is in a very wealthy profession. So really enjoyed this one quite a lot, and this is what kind of got me into Jasmine Guillory as an auto-buy author, so would highly recommend Jasmine Guillory if you've not checked her out. Additionally, a romance author that I don't have any of her books, I've only read them as library ebooks, is Alyssa Cole. I would particularly recommend her, I'm not sure what it's called, but the first one is called An Extraordinary Union. This is a historical romance series set around the Civil War, and this first one is another interracial relationship that follows our main protagonist who has gone undercover. She is a freed woman living in the North who has gone undercover as a slave into the South to spy on the slave master, who is part of a larger, he's I believe a Confederate officer, and so she, as part of this abolitionist union organization, she is spying on the Confederate officer who is her master, and then she develops a relationship with a white man who is also part of this same spy organization, who is posing as a Confederate soldier. And there is a lot of, again, important dialogues of the white man continues to say, like, oh, we are fighting the same fight, we're on the same side, and the black enslaved woman has to keep reminding him that while they are fighting the same fight, they are absolutely not on the same side, and their stakes of what is happening right now are much, much different for the two of them. So I think that one is also a phenomenal one, and I would highly recommend Alyssa Cole in general. She just writes a lot of great romances. She also has a contemporary romance series I'm sure you've heard of, which the first one is A Princess in Theory, which I've also read, and they are like royalty romances, so really would recommend those as well. Then moving in, one like mystery thriller author that I would highly recommend is Attica Locke. So I've read Bluebird as well as The Cutting Season. I actually read The Cutting Season first and would highly recommend that one. It is probably one of my favorite books. I don't even like mystery thrillers that much, and I absolutely love this book. It is very atmospheric, very solid mystery set in Louisiana on a plantation that has been turned into an event space, which is really all too common here in the South in terms of these plantations being turned into like private event space for like white people to have their weddings and stuff, which, you know, is a whole other topic really. And this follows a mystery that also has connections to an unsolved murder during the time that the plantation was actually a plantation with enslaved people. So would highly recommend The Cutting Season. It is really, really good. And then additionally, I have Bluebird, which follows a black Texas Ranger. He's one of the few black Texas Rangers as he investigates a crime in a small predominantly white town in rural Texas. And there's some great, that is potentially a hate crime. In fact, it turns out to be a hate crime, I do believe. And this one, as well as all of Attica Locke's work from what I've seen, really tackle important issues of race. Just, that's really all I have to say about them, so would highly recommend Attica Locke. Then a couple like fantasy sci-fi recommendations. First we have What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky by Leslie Nnedi Arima. Arima is a Nigerian woman who currently lives in the UK, and these are a phenomenal collection of speculative fiction stories. Every story in here is just like absolutely phenomenal. I've read this several years ago, so I can't remember specifics of any of the stories, but would highly recommend if you like speculative fiction. That pile is growing very large. We also have Witchmark by Seal Polk. This was a pretty underhyped fantasy published by Tor a couple years ago, I think 2018. Yeah, 2018. That is a alternate history set in Edwardian London, and everyone gets around on bicycles, and there is a gay romance in this one, and a mystery, and there's some very interesting dialogues in terms of wealth and privilege in this one, and I would highly recommend. And Seal Polk is a black Canadian woman, which is cool. Then a couple science fiction and fantasy ones that I don't have include the 5th season or the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. These are phenomenal. All three of them won the Hugo Award. Pretty much everyone has heard of these. If you haven't, you should read them. And they are a phenomenal fantasy series that has some amazing dialogues of race and class and systematic systems of oppression. So all really important stuff. Would highly recommend them, as well as I'm currently reading The City Boobie Came, which is N.K. Jemisin's latest release. This one is very explicit in its thematic messaging in terms of discussing how, let me back up. So this one tells the story of New York City, which in this world, in terms of like a reimagined our world, every city has a soul and a spirit, and New York City, given its 5 boroughs, has 5. And New York City has recently awoken at the start of the novel and is tasked with facing this evil to then be able to prosper as the city that we know and love. And this one has very explicit thematic messaging in terms of its social justice themes, in terms of its ideas as the enemy that the 5 boroughs are fighting is racism and systematic oppression and police brutality and capitalism. So if you have access to this one, I would highly recommend. I'll be talking more about this one in my Friday Reads video that I think I'll be doing this week. But N.K. Jemisin in general consistently brings themes of race and systematic inequality and white supremacy to all of her novels, and I would highly recommend her in general. The next one I have is Nnedi Okorafor, particularly her Binti trilogy. Nnedi Okorafor is kind of the one that brought Afrofuturism and African futurism to light in like the present science fiction fantasy consciousness, and Binti is no different. Binti is an Afrofuturistic science fiction novella series wherein this young girl, Binti, decides that she's going to leave her home on Earth to go to an intergalactic university, and there is some drama that happens in this first one on her way there. These are very short, very well written, very easy to get through little novels, and Nnedi Okorafor has a gigantic backlist that I can't wait to get into further myself, so would highly recommend Nnedi Okorafor as well. Additionally, we have A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow, which I just read this past month and would highly recommend. This one is another contemporary fantasy set in Portland, Oregon, that features two young black girls, one of whom is a siren, which is so in this world, magical beings exist, including sirens, and sirens have been predominantly black women, and for that reason have been silenced and put into hiding for several hundred years. So our main character, Effie, is also hiding the fact that she's a siren, but this begins to come to light after the murder of a black woman by her white boyfriend, which is complicated when he suggests that she was a siren and therefore his killing of her was justified. This one has some phenomenal examinations of racism, gender, and the intersection of those two things, as well as activism and incorporation of the Black Lives Matter movement. So would highly recommend A Song Below Water, as well as Bethany C. Morrow more broadly. And then finally, the last one I have is another very well-established author within the science fiction fantasy realm, which is Mel Hopkinton. Hopkinson is a Jamaican-born woman who currently lives in Canada, and as I said, she has a huge backlist. I have read Skinfolk, which is a short story collection she has. Again, if you like speculative, particularly on the more gory horror side of things, then I would highly recommend this collection. I did read it a couple years ago though, so I can't quite remember specifics again, but Mel Hopkinson is another author that I definitely want to highlight. And now I'm going to talk about 6 books that I am interested in reading that I have not yet read from before, but I do want to amplify their voices. The first of which is an author that I don't actually have any of her books yet, although she has a very extensive backlist and is another very well-established writer in the speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy realm, and that is Octavia Butler, specifically Kindred. I have been meaning to get to Kindred for several years now and just have not gotten around to it. Kindred is a time travel science fiction novel wherein a black woman living in the present day of the time of publication, which was around the 1970s, who continues to return to the antebellum South, wherein she discovers that the master of the plantation she continues to return to is one of her ancestors, and so there's an interesting grappling with racial dialogues in that. So I'm very excited to get to this one. Another author who has a pretty extensive backlist in terms of speculative fiction is Helen Oyeyemi. Oyeyemi is a Nigerian writer who lived in the UK for some time and now lives in Prague. This is the book that I have of hers, Gingerbread, and this tells the story of a girl who her and her mother have a kind of mystical gingerbread that they like to give to people, and they say they are from this country called Drustrana, which no one can find on the map, nor does it seem to exist in real life. So I'm very excited about this one. Additionally, we also have another debut that I actually pre-ordered, which is Conjure Woman by Afia Atakora. This is another neo-slave narrative that follows a mother and a daughter right before the Civil War, as well as their master's daughter. And I believe these 3 women are intertwined in some way, and I'm very excited about this one. And then I do have 2 nonfiction books, the first of which is Black is the Body by Emily Bernard. Bernard is an academic at the University of Vermont who I believe focuses her research on the Harlem Renaissance period. This is basically just a memoir, personal memoir of, as it says on the subtitle, stories from my grandmother's time, my mother's time, and mine. I'm very excited about this one. I've had it on my shelves for a little while and really want to get to it. And then finally we have Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That the Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall. This one is, I believe, an introduction kind of to Black feminist theory and the idea that basic human rights such as access to medical care, education, affordable housing are all things that are inherently feminist in nature, and yet the feminist movement frequently does not discuss those topics, particularly because they predominantly affect Black women and other women of color. So very, very excited about this one, hoping to get to it very soon. This is my most recent acquisition, and I'm very excited about it. And then finally, another author that I do not have any of her books yet, but I have been desperate to get to her, and that is Jasmine Ward. Either Salvage the Bone or Sing Unbury Sing is the book that I am hoping to start with first. If you have a recommendation, please put it in the comment section down below as to where to start with Jasmine Ward. But again, she's an author that I have been meaning to pick up for a long time and just have not gotten around to it, and I need to remedy that. So Jasmine Ward is a writer that was raised in the New Orleans area, and I believe she still lives there, and that's where a lot of her novels are set. Those are the 27 books and the Black women writers that I wanted to highlight. I do have a couple honorable mentions, the first of which is Ngozi Akazu, who wrote Check Please. She is a Black woman who is a graphic novelist, and while this book does not feature a Black main character, instead it's this white boy from the South, it does have Black characters in it. And then additionally, I would also recommend New Daughters of Africa by Margret Busby. This is a hefty anthology of women writers from the African diaspora across time and space. So it includes women currently living in Africa, women who can trace their ancestry to slavery in the Americas as well as in the Caribbean, British writers, really people from all over, and from all times, beginning from the late 1700s all the way to women that were born in the 1990s. This is a supplementary text that I am using. It's very heavy, so I'm going to put it down. This is a supplementary text that I'm using for my African Women Writers Project that I will put a link to my announcement for that video up in the cards above. And I believe that is all I want to say. Thank you so much for watching this video. Black lives matter. They matter every day, and they will continue to matter in the future. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.